Welcome to ODI, everyone. My name is Marta Foresti. I'm one of the managing directors here, and I'm very pleased to see all of you here, and a special welcome to our online audience to what is, I think, an exciting, important, urgent debate about aid. Let me just begin by making the kind of statement one will want to do at the end of a debate of this kind. And that is that the UK, there's no doubt in my mind that the UK has been the global leader in setting the international development agenda worldwide, but also that the UK has led the way in aid management, in setting aid strategies, in leading debates about aid spending, and ways in which aid can make a real difference. And I say that as a proud European. So it's especially, I think, useful to have the opportunity to spend a couple of hours today reflecting a little bit on what the history of this 20 years journey has been, and also what's ahead of us for the future of UK aid and development strategies. This 20 years journey is one where ODI and DFID have been fellow travelers. It's definitely been the case for the 12 years or so that I've been part of this journey, and we'll hear a lot about DFID during this event today. So allow me to say a couple of things about ODI and the aid agenda very briefly. At ODI, we take the business of doing aid very seriously. We are interested in the way aid is delivered, how aid money is being spent, and whether aid makes a difference. The one thing we do not do at ODI, and I'm proud of that, is that we try hard not to jump on bandwagon or ride media storms about whether aid is a good thing or a bad thing, or whether aid works. And we try to keep calm and carry on and keep the focus on how aid works and whether the way is spent, is invested, the way is done can make the difference. And we try to do our bit to try that, to help with that endeavor. And the paper that we launched today, Craig's and Brendan's paper on the politics of the results agenda, is just the latest example of our attempt to try to work the problem, look inside, and see how things can be done differently. Is the latest of a series of work that tried to look at doing development differently and doing development better. We also, just to reassure you, don't only work for DFID, we work with a range of agencies around the world, try to help devise better strategies and better ways of working. So with that in mind, I encourage all of you to stay engaged with us in this work, because it's the kind of work that doesn't go away where the titles of the Daily Mail go away. So we keep at it and we keep trying to work the problem and trying to make aid better. Of the many interesting findings of Craig's and Brendan paper, one that struck me the most, or one of those that struck me the most, is one that states that the commitment to 0.7% of national GDP to aid spending has been both a blessing and a curse for DFID at times of austerity, and it calls for a different, more honest, more open debate with the public about how aid works. And on that, I hope today will help to make a contribution to. And before I hand over to Bronwyn, let me just say how pleased I am that both the paper and the debate today is very much centered on the role of politicians in setting the agenda. Too often we assume that there is something inherently technocratic or bureaucratic about monitoring systems, evaluations and results, whereas, as we will hear, this is goes at the heart of the politics of aid. And I can't think of anyone better than Secretary of State who has served in DFID to share their experience and their reflections on that. So the other thing I'm really looking for today is hear from Bronwyn Maddox, who is going to chair this event. Bronwyn is the director of the Institute for Government, which of course is a think tank that looks at how government works and how decisions are made across government, which I think is going to be a key bit of insights today, because as much as we talk about DFID and aid, we really need to place that debate in the broader political landscape in UK government. Before joining the Institute for Government, Bronwyn was a journalist and was the editor and the chief executive of Prospect magazine. And before that, she was chief foreign commentator and foreign editor for The Times, and worked before also at the Financial Times, and again, commenting on a range of both domestic and international debates, which is exactly what we need today to have a really impactful, thoughtful debate on aid. So Bronwyn, without further ado, please.
Thanks very much indeed for that introduction, and also for that central point of bringing the politics into it, which is what this report is about. It is too easy, as we know from technocratic discussions in many fields, to regard politics as this nuisance that somehow crashes in and stops everyone perfecting the machine or perfecting what they're doing or running the country. And the strength of this report is it sets out to talk about that, and the strength of our panel today. So that's the report by Craig and Brendan, which is launched today, which is that precise question, a kind of narrow question, if you like, within the aid discussion of the politics of the results agenda in DFID. But of course, the much broader question we have set for us today of DFID at 20, what have we learned and where next? Well, I'm going to be putting questions to the panel who are going to talk really briefly. Please do send in your questions, which I will get on this iPad. And we'll have a good time for discussion after the panel discussion. We've got more than half an hour for that. You can tweet as well on hashtag DFID at 20, please do. And with that, let me just say briefly, welcome and his brief introduction to today's speakers. We've got Douglas Alexander, who was Secretary of State for International Development from 2007 to 2010, not quiet years. Andrew Mitchell, same role, 2010 to 2012. Lynn Featherstone, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at DFID 2012 to 2014. And Craig Walters, one of the two authors of this report with Brendan sitting over there, ODI Research Fellow and co-author of this report. Craig, you're going to kick off for us by taking us down to the question addressed in your report. And just tell us for a start what you mean by the results agenda and then what you found.
Sure. Thanks first to say it's fantastic to be on a panel like this. Delighted to be here. You know, we set out in the report to outline a history of DFID through the lens of the results agenda, right? So you'll see a lot of detailing about DFID itself. And defining results and defining the results agenda, we have to separate those two things out. On the one hand, you have results. Colloquially speaking, we're all interested in whether DFID or aid more broadly is achieving results, the outcomes of aid, right? The results agenda is a particular political means for trying to achieve that, which has had very serious management implications within DFID and across UK aid in terms of centralised target setting, aggregating project numbers up to a whole, and a range of other things that have come along with it, including a lot of, encouraging a lot of specificity about what projects can achieve ahead of time and then tracking them along those goals. You want to know more about what I found now?
No, just a bit on what you found, but also how do you really separate the results and the results agenda? Because we all know the political pressure to demonstrate results in a department now of 13 billion or so a year. Aren't you setting aside that too lightly, some might say?
Not at all. I think a results agenda has to be fit for purpose, right? It has to actually support aid to be more effective, to be more accountable. And the argument in our paper, it doesn't necessarily do that. I mean, what we try and do is step back from just this narrow results debate. As you say, it can get too narrow. Step back and take a look at what have we learned when you look at how politics has influenced management over these 20 years. And what you learn is that a political agenda like the results agenda can really have a lot of influence over how aid is managed. It has a huge influence how over aid is managed. You know, demands for accountability, as important as they are, have a huge influence over whether you can do effective aid on the ground. And so, you know, that's our first point, if you like, is a kind of starting point of our paper, is that the politics really influences the management. We have to be aware of that because it can both support and challenge effective aid.
I mean, just trying to get a nugget of, from you of exactly what you think the results agenda is doing wrong, or what the malign effects are of this before we go on to talk about the politics.
Let me give one caveat to that first, if you don't mind, is just to say that I think the focus on results is absolutely essential. There's no debate on that as far as I'm concerned. You have to be focused on what aid can achieve. But the challenge that it brings is that when you start to centralise target setting from government, and bear in mind we're working in other people's countries, it can create some bad incentives within the organisation. So, for example, it can lead to a focus on short-term results over kind of longer-term, wider processes of change, right? It can lead to prioritising the views and the needs of UK taxpayers over the people's countries that we're working in. And it can also lead to this idea that we can be certain about what we'll achieve. If you start fixing targets and asking organisations to meet them, there is an incentive for them to kind of say, yes, definitely we can meet them. There's a certainty that comes with that, which doesn't actually align very well with how we know how aid works in practice. We're often working on really intangible, difficult issues in other people's countries. So it comes with a lot of challenges, however important the agenda is.
Okay, thanks for that, because there's a lot to debate just packed into that. Douglas, let's go to your experience and what you make, not just of what Craig said, but of how you set the goals for DFID.
Well, Bronwyn, thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Craig for the report, of which more later, and also thank you to ODI. Along with the International Development Select Committee, I've got Malcolm Bruce, its former chair, sitting in front of me. I regarded ODI and the Select Committee, respectively, as both my mentors and tormentors when I was Secretary of State. So I'm looking forward with a certain trepidation to the discussion that we have today. In all seriousness, ODI have given extraordinary thought leadership over those 20 years, and for that, I think all of us on this panel should be hugely grateful. We've all seen the television pictures of Hurricane Irma in recent days, and its terrible destructive power. I was talking to a climatologist last week who said one of the worst mistakes that you can make is to confuse the climate with the weather. And by that, he went on in very technical terms to explain exactly what he meant. But I think that's useful in understanding Craig's report, because it seems to me we need to differentiate between the news of politics and the climate of ideas. And that is important because we tend to live, and a lot of the commentary lives in the weather of politics. Politics profoundly affects the climate of ideas, but what were the ideas that have shaped DFID over the last 20 years? I would cite two very specific examples from my time as Secretary of State. Firstly, the advent of the global financial crisis. It undoubtedly changed the fiscal environment amongst donors in the North. It also had a profound effect on public attitudes in the North towards experts, towards governments, towards elites more generally. And in that sense, I think it's important to recognise that in the North, there was a profound impact caused by 2007-2008. Indeed, I would argue 2007-2008 is going to be judged one of those years, perhaps like 1989, 1945, on which people's sense of how the world worked changed, and that's had a profound effect on the discourse around development. I'm happy to talk about that.
In what way?
Well, in a sense that in the 10 years up until 2007, there was a general narrative, a meta-narrative that said the world is coming together, and more people are having the opportunity to benefit from a coincidence of trade, technology, liberalisation. 1 billion people entering the labour market, people advancing into a global economy, with the result that we'd lifted more people out of poverty in recent years than in recent centuries. In the North, that discourse has been challenged more effectively since 2007 than in the years preceding it, with people saying exactly those forces, trade, technology, liberalisation, have actually disempowered the many, enriched the 1%, and actually disadvantaged significant numbers. And the politics of populism that challenges aid draws energy from that alternative narrative that simply wasn't a feature of the pre-crisis world. The second feature I would draw out, though, the second from the climate of ideas, if you like, is the changing geography of poverty. And I feel if there was a gap in this report, it was the extent to which policymakers of all hues were seeking to come to terms with a changing geography of poverty by 2007. The sense that, by that time, we broadly knew how to deliver aid effectively in relatively stable, very poor, but benign environments across sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in the world. And actually the new challenge was to say, how do we deliver aid effectively in conflict-affected and fragile states in particular? And I do think, truthfully, there is a tension there between the thought leadership that DFID historically has shown in the aid community as it moved towards conflict-affected and fragile states and the results-based agenda that the report discusses. My final observation, Bronwyn was suitably disciplining on us to be short, is on the results-based agenda, and in particular the politics of the results-based agenda, there are ditches on both sides of the road. One ditch is a lack of accountability. I do believe, in terms of aid effectiveness, you have an equal responsibility to the world's poor and to the British taxpayer, and it would be a department living on borrowed time if it didn't recognise both of those responsibilities. But at the same time, if you have a public discourse around aid that shouts ever louder about not just transparency but corruption, the only word the British public are going to hear is corruption. And if we want not to have a self-defeating narrative about aid, then perhaps we need a more balanced approach than the politics of the results-based agenda has delivered in recent years.
Douglas, thanks for that, and thanks for taking us up to what you call the climate of ideas, because it has been an extraordinary 20 years. We've had, I mean, not just the particular challenge of 2007, 2008, to our model of organising things, if you like, but a kind of, seems to me, growing 20-year debate about development itself, about what works and what doesn't, with challenges from Paul Collier to Bill Easterly and Joe Stiglitz saying, look, if you haven't got good government there, there really is such a thing as wasting all the money and taking issue with some of the old development enthusiasms. And you've got new causes for development and new claims on that rising up at the same time. And you have, which fell in your time as well, particular torments, to pick up your word, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, which taught us something as well about whether we can help countries in precisely the way that we thought we could at the time. I'm using "we" in a very general sense there. Let's come back to some of those questions, because this is exactly the subject of today's discussion. Andrew, how would you respond to these two? Not just the results agenda, but the kind of what we now should think about what works in aid.
Well, first of all, I broadly agree with everything Douglas has said. And let me pay tribute to ODI as well, who I see Simon and Alison here from its previous heads. And certainly when I was Secretary of State, I upped the amount of money that was made available to ODI, not because I wanted them to agree with the government, but because I wanted them to give some real depth to British international leadership in this area. And I'm very pleased to see this report today. You challenged Craig on the where he disagreed with the results agenda. And I disagree with all 3 points that he made, which is merely to say that I think that the agenda is even stronger than is set out in his report. You made him think of 3 problems. I think those 3 problems don't exist. And there's a couple of points in the report, which I think is an excellent report, which I think are self-serving and wrong, which I hope you'll give me an opportunity to talk about in a moment. Now, I think that DFID has had 20 pretty good years. I mean, any government department dealing in this area is bound to face enormous challenges. And the approach that I tried to take when I became Secretary of State was to accept that actually the brouhaha and hurly-burly of politics can be quite irritating, and that this is a British agenda. And what we set out to do was really to build an additional floor on the building that Labour had done when they set up DFID and under Claire Short and Hillary and Douglas's tutelage. We didn't want to dismantle anything, we wanted to build on it. But we had an analysis which said there are 3 or 4 absolutely key priorities. One is to incorporate DFID rather better into Whitehall. There's a point in the report that is made that I mentioned to Craig, which is that from time to time DFID felt a bit like a rather well-upholstered NGO moored off the coast of Whitehall, and it needs to be more wired into Whitehall. And actually the setting up of the National Security Council did an awful lot to do that, as well as the fact that when William and I took over our respective departments, we made it absolutely clear that DFID wasn't going back into the Foreign Office, which in a sense settled definitively that debate, although I accept that recently it's been slightly reopened. But basically it settled it for that period of time. Secondly, the conflict agenda, which we regarded as vital because, as Sir Paul Collier said, conflict is development in reverse, and we thought we needed to focus very carefully on that, and it was a coalition, a key coalition priority. And thirdly, to recognise that the way in which poor people lift themselves out of poverty above all is through being economically active and having a job, and that sometimes the NGOs felt that the private sector was the enemy of development. We wanted to show that the private sector was the engine of development. And fourthly, the results agenda. So those were the 4 things. Now, on the results agenda, I'd love to say that it was a deep intellectual insight, but I think it was just pure common sense. And when I was Secretary of State, I ran a group which DFID serviced and policed of donor ministers, particularly European donor ministers where we would get together and discuss these things. And it became very clear indeed that the results agenda as we set it out had received huge amount of acceptance, and all around the world donor nations accepted this, and indeed countries like Rwanda and Ethiopia and so on accepted the priority of this. Why? Because you will never, in a time of austerity, sustain support for international development against the Daily Mail, against those who say that charity begins at home, to which I always used to say, but it doesn't stop there. You will never maintain that unless you can demonstrate results. And it's pure common sense. If you're spending taxpayers' money at a time when competition for taxpayers' money has never been greater, you've got to demonstrate why you're doing it so that you can satisfy at least reasonable taxpayers that it's an investment in their future, their children, their grandchildren's future, which really, really matters. And so I think it's just good common sense. And I always
so the points on which you specifically disagree.
Well, all three of them I disagree about.
But the results agenda is worth having. All right, all of it.
Yeah.
Yep.
So just the three, but you forced him to produce three negatives. So you know,
Well, they were embedded in what he was saying.
Yeah. Well, let me come back to that. The importance, and there's a little bit in the 3 points that he identified, which answer to this, is there has always been a tendency, because Britain is so good at international development, what we do is world leading. I used to say, mainly to tease the Daily Mail, that while America was a military superpower, Britain was a development superpower. But there was a slight tendency in the sector sometimes to say to politicians and taxpayers, listen, Sonny, we know what we're doing. Just give us the money and don't you bother your pretty little head about it. And I thought it was very important to say that with the point 7, with politicians, you know, putting taxpayers' money, investing taxpayers' money in this sector very greatly. I used to sit around the cabinet table while my colleagues' budgets were being shredded, almost embarrassed by the fact that we had, but very proud that we'd stood by the point 7. You've got to demonstrate that it's being well spent, and that's the reason for the ICAI, and it's the reason for the results agenda, to show people that this is not something they just have to take on faith, but there is a real reason why we're doing this, and to demonstrate that through the results agenda.
All right, Andrew, thanks very much indeed for that. Again, lots that we can come back on. Lynn, what's your response to this? And also, if you could give us a sense of your experience during the coalition government of whether Conservative and Liberal views of development aligned.
Yes, well, of course, I wasn't Secretary of State. Unlike the other two, I was an Undersecretary, which meant I had a very different view. And during the coalition era, where I felt really I was leading an insurgency, basically, because as an Undersecretary, people don't have to tell you things. They can make your workload, your payload, very, very heavy, so you haven't got time to do other things. So I developed a different technique. I chose 3 or 4 things on which I wanted to make progress. Probably most notable amongst them, the FGM campaign and the disability framework and the international LGBT area. And to make progress, I focused my energy, what was left after my long payload, on those kind of things. But what I would say is I thought when I came in, I didn't know much about international development in the way of politics. But I thought that the results agenda was exactly what Andrew said. I thought his multilateral and bilateral aid reviews were fantastic. I thought for the first time they kind of said to organisations that were used to getting money from DFID, actually, it's not a job for life. You're not going to get money every year automatically. And I thought that was a good step forward. And of course, you have to have a results agenda. I thought that was incredibly important. But I saw 2 things. One, DFID is full of civil servants who are born with the right stuff in them. I don't know how it happens, but they just want to change the world for the better, and they use all their energy to do so. And in terms of the results agenda, they swung immediately to the current Secretary of State. And things changed quite rapidly towards economic development as opposed to kind of where it had come from. And I don't disagree that you don't need good economic development. And the results agenda itself, to me, what I saw meant counting things and endless bureaucracy. I felt, like if I gave you one example, I went to Zambia and I visited a school, and this meant that X number of children would be educated for X number of years, and that was countable. But the teachers couldn't read or write. So I thought the qualitative part of that agenda was really not equal to the task. And we were able to defend ourselves publicly, but we weren't brave publicly in explaining exactly how challenging the environments that DFID worked in were. It was a very simplistic thing. Look what a good job we're doing from the numbers. And I also felt that was backed up by even more bureaucracy with business cases. I mean, the end-to-end review changed some of that, but when I was there, I spent my life reading business cases, and civil servants spent their life writing business cases, and the cut and paste was often wrong because it became casual and it became procedural. And what you need is an absolute balance between the absolute rigor of a results agenda that has room for the challenges in working in conflict and fragile states. So that's a swift analysis of my time at DFID.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, we've got to, I'm going to just discuss this a bit with the panel and then come to the many questions that I know are out there. I'm going to come at really two things. One is what the purposes of British aid development spending ought to be. Now, poverty reduction is there, is the stated aim. We're in times, though, when there are many claims on this, from military help to trade with the Brexit agenda coming up, and so on. How much do you think that the British aid should, and how much can it stick to the very pure notion of simply poverty reduction in other countries? And then I want to get to the question of communicating this with the public, and where the politics in the widest sense of aid now are, what the feeling is. Douglas, do you want to start on this, and then I'll come to Craig and the rest.
I'm interested that you use the word pure. I would use the word clear in terms of the purpose of DFID. For me, the alleviation of extreme poverty is perhaps the greatest generational challenge that we face, along with climate change. And in that sense, I think British aid has a significant contribution to make. And I don't think we should ever resile from the moral clarity of saying this is a wrong that can be righted, and Britain has a contribution to make, along with others internationally, to righting that wrong. So it struck me that the narrative around development can reasonably include both moral clarity and strategic self-interest. It is both right and in Britain's interest to live in a fairer, more equal, more sustainable world. And in that sense, my worry about the politics of the results-based agenda is that far from strengthening the narrative around aid, it has on occasion weakened it. And if you look at the choices that you face as a Secretary of State, should we spend £10 million more on abolishing school user fees in Tanzania, or should we spend £10 million more on security sector reform in Somalia? If you are constrained and prescribed by the politics of the results agenda, you'll spend the money in Tanzania, you won't spend the money in Somalia. And I think that there is a strong case for saying, not least given the changing nature of the geography of poverty and the thought leadership that Britain historically has aspired to in this space, we should be willing to both deliver excellence in how we deliver aid in Tanzania, but be brave, courageous and honest with the public about why we're also working in a country like Somalia.
Thanks. Craig, do you want to come in on this? And also, we were talking before this event started on the proportion of DFID's budget that actually is already spent by other departments, which people might like to hear about.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's an estimation at the moment that 26% of aid spending is now going through other government departments, and that's a massive challenge both for DFID and transferring some of its experience over time, and for the other government departments having a rapid increase in aid spending, which comes with all sorts of different strings in terms of transparency and accountability, rightly so, that I think many of those government departments aren't set up to do. And in fact, the scrutiny bodies that do exist, that have subjected these departments and the cross-departmental spend, such as ICAI and others, have suggested that there's real challenges there. So, you know, there are many scrutiny bodies that exist, and they're showing there are challenges in exactly this area, in ensuring that it is used for the purposes of poverty reduction, even if there are, and I think there have been forever, diverse aims that are bound up within that.
Andrew.
First of all, I think there is a danger that you over-intellectualise the results agenda, and I think we're getting a little bit of that. It is the job of the Secretary of State to determine the balance of the arguments between the Somalia and security and conflict spending and schooling in Tanzania, and to reach a judgment. And certainly when I was Secretary of State, I expected to be able to justify the results of that spending in either example. I certainly didn't think you just went for the easy results in the easy sectors. So I would argue that you mustn't interpret the results agenda too narrowly. If I can just return to the 3 points that Craig made earlier, which in this excellent report, which things I thought stuck out as being wrong. On page 29, it says, yet some different civil servants had concerns, particularly in relation to the DRF and the BAR, the bar processes. As one DFID staff member put it, the absurdity kicked in. Officers were competing with each other to deliver results. It really encouraged an optimism bias. Everyone wanted a bigger budget and deliver bigger results, and this sent us in the wrong direction. That must have been a very junior official, because the whole idea of the peer review of the bilateral aid review was to stop that happening. And it also, whoever the official was who said that, is denigrating his colleagues, his or her colleagues, because the rigour with which officials in DFID conducted the bilateral aid review certainly transcends anything like that. There's then a quote from IBAN 2015-20. In 2012, DFID claimed to the British public that it had secured schooling for 11 million children, more than we educate in the UK, but at 2.5% of the cost. Everyone else involved in helping those 11 million children get to school had disappeared from the narrative. That, if I may say so, is a ludicrous statement. You're looking here, you're not seeking to denigrate the extraordinary work that's been done by all the people who will have been involved in getting those 11 million children to school. What you're doing is you're explaining to the British public in a very simple and direct way why what we're doing is extremely good. And so far from denigrating it in that way, actually that's a very extremely good statistic. And it was one of Minouche Shafiq's, when she was my permanent secretary's, favourite ones. And the third and final one, on page 32, I just use, is that in 2015, ICAI offered a heavy criticism of the results agenda. From an early stage, ICAI had been vocal about the counterproductive elements of DFID's results focus. This culminated in a review on DFID's approach to impact, which argued that the results agenda had firmly established when and where taxpayers' money is being spent, but not what spending actually achieves. Now, that is, if I may say so, is equally a ludicrous statement, because the results agenda is supposed to go beyond the first part of that, where and when taxpayers' money is spent, into what it's actually being spent on. So, that is, I think, completely wrong. But with those 3 examples, I think it's a very good report. Now, in respect of other departments,
Andrew has literally shredded.
No. I mean, I just think that those points are. You forced him to put up the negatives. Those broadly were the negatives, and I don't think
carefully put up both sides.
And I don't think they are. Well, I don't think they are negatives. In terms of the other departmental spending, it's a very good point. When Douglas and I were there, I think it was about 8%. I think, if that. And DFID officials had control over it. But equally, it was clear, particularly in the 2010 environment, that where other departments, under the ODA rules, could spend this money, it would have been, political and intellectual suicide for the Secretary of State to try and say, no, you can't have it. So the definition reigns supreme. And remember that the key pledge is not the money so much as the rules, because once the rules change or are disavowed, the DFID budget will be plundered by other stronger departments. And as I said in the House of Commons in the Queen's speech after the election, there's a danger that Boris might see the DFID budget in much the way that a Spanish pirate or sea captain would have viewed a sort of a vessel loaded with bullion, which they could climb aboard and plunder. So, you know, the rules are actually the critical thing. And
I have to say the Foreign Office does not look like one of Whitehall's strongest departments now, or even and in size of budget.
Well, you've seen that, you know, the Foreign Office with the two-hatted ministers. You know, there's no doubt what's going on here, and we have to be careful of that. But the point is the rules governing the spending, which are the key, and that's why the ICAI is supposed to follow the spending, regardless of what department it is in, and why the ICAI, of course, reports to the International Development Select Committee, and the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and other select committees argued that if they were spending the money, they should be accountable. But the fact is, ODA money is accountable in many ways, but through the ICAI, all ODA money, regardless of which department is spending it.
Okay, Douglas Craig, then I'm going to bring in Lynn on something.
Very eloquently about a hypothetical future risk of the Foreign Office misspending ODA scoreable money. I mean, we don't need to look in the crystal ball. Look at the Prosperity Fund. You know, the idea that the Foreign Office has, on the basis of the ODA scoreable rules, the capability to spend that money effectively, I'm afraid has already been disproved. And as somebody who served for 2 years in the Foreign Office and has a great deal of respect for that department, as well as 3 years as Secretary of State for DFID, I just make a point I made earlier. The currency of DFID is numbers. The currency of the Foreign Office is words. If you are a talented aspirant diplomat in the Foreign Office, you do not believe that your future is going to be dictated and your promotion achieved by the excellence of the aid effectiveness of the expenditure you oversee. You believe it's writing a brilliant document that secures this Brexit outcome or that international trade agreement. And the fact is, it's one of the reasons why 20 years on, I do think Britain has established that leadership role in international development. We had the humility to say the culture of the Foreign Office is fundamentally different from the culture of DFID, and we are already living with the consequences of exactly the scenario that Andrew paints as a hypothetical scenario in terms of the misspending of aid. And we also have the consequence that the Daily Mail then attacks DFID for spending money badly, when in reality it's being badly spent by the Foreign Office.
Can I bring in Lynn on this? You can come back, and so can Craig. Lynn, what you feel about the spreading of money between different departments, and also where you think public opinion is on this?
Well, I think it was inevitable with a budget of that size in a time of austerity that other departments would get the green-eyed monster and stare. And I know during my time there, I went to interminable meetings where I think it was the Home Office was trying to persuade me to agree to prisons being built with ODA money in some far-flung place because that would be good for us, which I obviously never allowed to happen in my era and never happened. But it was inevitable that there was creep. Where I think things got even more complicated from where I was standing, and don't forget, as a Liberal Democrat, I had more trouble with things like the Prosperity Fund, where I saw relationships growing in order to spend money in a way that I didn't think was entirely kosher, basically. And I would get very frustrated when the model was to help the poorest and most fragile states in the world, and there would be many trips to Tanzania. You know, that was the most frequently visited country. In terms of public opinion, I think it is absolutely fed by a Daily Mail agenda that focuses on things that are never explained properly. I can't remember, recently it was the girl band in, remind me which country. Ethiopia. Okay, but, you know, I would...
Obviously we noticed.
Well, that's what happens. That's all you hear. But as someone who is the violence against women champion across the whole world, this is an amazingly important agenda. Women who are affected, they are the poorest and most fragile of across the world. They are the recipients of violence beyond what anyone can measure. And the fact that in order to reach young girls and build confidence, you may use what look like a strange methodology. Actually, these things have been worked out in country, working with young people. And so I think public opinion is wrongly formed by the Daily Mail, and that there's never been enough platforms for, say, someone like me to go out and argue the case, because Daily Mail won't report me. They'll report Andrew, they'll report Douglas, but they won't report what I say about violence against women, because that's not in their interest to know that this actually might have been an effective avenue to build confidence amongst young girls and give them something in life. So I think we're up against it in terms of public opinion.
Lynn, thanks very much indeed for that. Okay, let me take quick comments for the three of you, and then I want to bring in Brendan. Right now, Andrew.
Well, the scrapping of the so-called Ethiopian Spice Girls was absolutely disgraceful, and I hope I excoriated the decision in the Sunday Times a few weeks later, but it was a very, very bad decision indeed. What Douglas and I are saying is not different. I think that we are probably both disagreeing with Bronwyn that the Foreign Office isn't powerful, because it is extremely powerful. But there is a danger in the Foreign Office. I used to tease diplomats that they thought that development was the ambassador's spouse's favourite charity. And also, the classic example of this is that the Foreign Office decided to spend money on studying the mating habits of the flat fish in Madagascar. And when the Daily Mail, quite rightly, complained about this, the Foreign Office said, oh, it's nothing to do with us, it's all to do with DFID, because it's DFID's money. And therefore, Foreign Office neatly got DFID into the Daily Mail's favourite position on something that was entirely the Foreign Office's fault. And it's essential that, that the Foreign Office justifies its spending money in China today. But, it's in a very narrow way. It might be justifiable. The first thing I did when I got into the Secretary of State's office was to say no more money for China unless it's legally due. But the Foreign Office wants to spend little bits of money because it's good for the British relationship with China, and they try and slide it under the ODA rules. Now, if you're going to do that, at the very least, the Foreign Office and Foreign Office ministers must justify it and explain it and not dump the blame on DFID.
Great. Quick comments?
If you think about what have been the fundamentals of DFID success and of development success in the UK over the last 20 years, I would argue it was the decision to untie aid, and the risks of the retying of aid, it seems to me, are real. Secondly, the establishment of a discrete cabinet-rank department, and the risk of the genuine independence of DFID with the appointment of two ministers of state jointly answering to Priti Patel and Boris Johnson are very real. And thirdly, an upward movement in public support for the legitimacy of taxpayer funding being used for development. It seems to me all three of those essential foundations of progress over the last 20 years are now in jeopardy. And so forgive my concern, but if the last 20 years have been years of progress, I think we're looking ahead to years of certain jeopardy.
Thanks, Craig, and then I'm going to come to Brendan.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I have no choice but to come back on this results agenda issue right now. And I think the first thing is, as a political argument, Andrew, I agree with you. You absolutely had to make the case. And I don't think anyone would disagree with you on that point. I think, I don't think we've over-intellectualised. I think the results agenda has been over-operationalised. It's been dug right into the fabric of DFID, and people don't feel like they have the flexibility and space to learn, to change, and to get aid right. And, the quote that you pulled out was from ICAI, the organisation you set up to scrutinise aid. And it said that the results agenda had led to a focus on short-term efficiency and accountability over long-term sustainable change. So this was ICAI. So for that, I think we have to be concerned about the results of the results agenda. It can't just be a political argument.
Okay, thanks for that. Let me come to Brendan. Brendan, there's a lot of interesting points you might want to come in on, but I want to ask you one in particular. We haven't really talked about the part of DFID's aid that goes through multilateral agencies. I wondered how you felt in putting together this report with Craig, how that fitted together with the results agenda, whether DFID is held directly accountable for that spending and where that might go in the future.
I think we don't so much address, in fact, the multilateral aid reporting in this. I think for us the focus is very much on the bilateral aid and the money that gets spent through the country offices. I think traditionally multilateral aid has been much less easy to hold to account than the bilateral aid. And I think to some degree it slipped. Well, certainly it slipped through. I would say it slipped through to some degree this particular report. I mean,
Never mind. There's many other good things in it. Would you like to come back at some of the wider discussion then that we've been having?
Sure. I mean, of course, I sort of agree with Craig's points. I mean, I think the
not inevitable.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few things that come out of this in terms of going forward and what sort of management reforms DFID might want to put in place. I mean, I think the conclusions that we were coming to is that, you know, the results agenda was a much better fit for some kinds of aid than other kinds of aid. I think it was a really good fit for some of the simpler and shorter kinds of theory of change that DFID were doing, but less good in some of the more complex environments that Douglas Alexander was talking about, and some of the more complex interventions. And I think for us, a lot of what we were trying to look at was how you could get a management system that fits the broader spectrum of aid that DFID is trying to do. And there's a political commitment that you need to make at that point. Do you want to continue to do that broader spectrum of aid? You could simplify it, do a lot fewer of the more complex, more interesting, more structural forms of aid, but that would then maybe fit in better with the results agenda and the sort of political commitments and the political stance that you're taking. But I mean, I think it's quite important that DFID continue the sort of broader spectrum of aid and some of the more deeper and more interesting forms of aid, and that. I think we came to a position where that would require fewer centralised, aggregated and fixed results targets, and a sort of move away from a thinking that looks towards predictable results, and that's kind of the where we're coming to in the paper.